So there are some disadvantages to crowns, but otherwise they're quite important things.
There are some disadvantages to crowns, but otherwise they're quite important things. Deep inside the private archives of Windsor Castle, a sealed document surfaced, one Queen Elizabeth II never intended for public eyes. It contained unprecedented instructions regarding her private estate, bypassing expectations and igniting fury within the royal family. The chosen beneficiary was not a senior royal, nor Camilla's relative, but Lady Louise Windsor, a figure who had spent her life avoiding the spotlight. The decision reopened old rivalries and triggered behind-the-scenes outrage. Why did the Queen choose Lady Louise? Join us as we expose the royal infighting triggered by Lady Louise's inheritance of the Queen's private estate. A discovery that shattered royal silence. It started with routine maintenance. A staff member assigned to reorganize one of Windsor Castle's lesser-used libraries pulled an old bookshelf away from the wall. And that's when everything changed. Behind volumes that hadn't been touched in decades, tucked into a gap that seemed deliberately carved out, sat a leather portfolio bearing the royal insignia. The worker, a veteran of palace service spanning nearly 30 years, knew immediately this wasn't something to be handled casually. The portfolio was sealed with the kind of wax stamp that hadn't been used in official royal correspondence for years. But the signature across the seal was unmistakable. This had come from Queen Elizabeth herself. Protocol required that such a discovery should be reported immediately to senior household staff. Within the hour, 3 of the Queen's most trusted former advisors were summoned. They arrived separately, each sworn to secrecy before being shown what had been discovered. When they broke the seal and read the contents, witnesses say the room fell into stunned silence. Inside was a detailed directive penned in the Queen's distinctive handwriting outlining the disposition of a property that wasn't supposed to exist. Not Balmoral, where she had passed away. Not Sandringham, her Norfolk retreat. This was something else entirely, something that had been maintained under a veil of secrecy that had lasted more than half a century. The document was dated, time-stamped, and witnessed by 2 individuals whose names were redacted for privacy, but the content was crystal clear. Queen Elizabeth had designated Lady Louise Windsor as the sole inheritor of this mysterious estate, along with everything contained within its walls. No other family members were mentioned. There were also no provisions for shared access. Just Louise and Louise alone. What made the discovery even more explosive was the timing. The document had been created 3 full years before the Queen's death, meaning this wasn't a last-minute decision made in declining health. This was calculated and had been kept secret with extraordinary care. Senior palace officials who thought they knew every detail of the Queen's affairs were blindsided. Even King Charles, when informed, reportedly had no knowledge of the property's existence, let alone his mother's plans for it. The first question everyone asked was obvious. Why hide this? If the Queen wanted to leave something to her granddaughter, why not include it in her official will? Why go through the elaborate process of concealing both the property and her intentions? The answer, insiders would soon discover, had everything to do with protecting Louise from exactly the kind of scrutiny and conflict that was now erupting around her. But the more pressing question was what exactly had Louise inherited? And why was Camilla's family reacting as though they'd been personally robbed? The Scottish secret that changed everything. The property in question sits in one of the most remote corners of the Scottish Highlands, far from tourist routes and royal watchers. For decades, locals had known it simply as the Grey House, a substantial stone estate that employed a small but loyal staff and received occasional visitors who arrived and departed without fanfare. Nobody connected it to the royal family because officially it had no connection. The land had been purchased through a complex network of trusts in the early 1950s, shortly after Elizabeth ascended to the throne. The transaction had been structured specifically to keep the Crown estate out of the equation, ensuring the property would be considered private rather than public. This wasn't unusual. The Queen owned several private properties. What was unusual was that this particular estate had been kept completely off the radar. No photographs of the property existed in public archives. It had never been mentioned in any royal biography or historical account. Staff members who worked there had signed confidentiality agreements that went far beyond typical employment contracts with severe legal consequences for any breach. Even the property's official name, used only in internal documents, was deliberately generic to avoid drawing attention. The estate itself was substantial. Over 200 acres of highland terrain, with the main house containing more than 40 rooms, but its value wasn't in size or location. What made this property priceless was what Queen Elizabeth had stored inside over 7 decades of reign. This was a private archive, personal museum, and sanctuary from the demands of public life. The rooms contained items that scholars and historians would give anything to access. There were personal letters exchanged with her father, King George V, during the years before he unexpectedly became king. Annotated diaries spanning her entire reign documenting her private thoughts about world events, political leaders, and family matters. Artwork that had been removed from public circulation and stored for safekeeping. Jewelry that predated the official crown jewels collection. And perhaps most significantly, correspondence with figures ranging from Winston Churchill to Margaret Thatcher, unfiltered by the sanitization that typically affects official records. But beyond the historical artifacts, the estate held something even more personal. Queen Elizabeth had used this property as a genuine retreat, the place she went when the weight of monarchy became too heavy to bear. While the public knew about Balmoral and Sandringham, this was where she went when she needed to truly disappear. The gardens had been designed to her specifications. The library reflected her actual reading preferences, not the carefully curated image presented to the public. Even the kitchen reflected her genuine tastes rather than state dinner requirements. Staff members who had served there over the years described it as the only place they'd ever seen the Queen completely relaxed. She walked the grounds without security hovering. She spent hours in the library without appointments that dictated her schedule. She invited only the people she genuinely wanted to see, not those protocol demanded she entertain. In every meaningful way, this was her true home, and she had kept it secret from nearly everyone. Now, learning that this intensely personal space had been left entirely to Lady Louise sent shock waves through those who thought they understood the Queen's priorities. What made this particular granddaughter worthy of receiving the Queen's most private sanctuary? And how had a relationship deep enough to warrant such a gift developed without anyone noticing, the bond nobody saw developing? To understand why Queen Elizabeth chose Lady Louise, you have to look past the public image of the royal family and examine the relationships that developed away from cameras and official engagements. While the world focused on William and Harry on the line of succession and future kings, something quieter but equally profound was happening between the Queen and her second youngest grandchild. Lady Louise had always been different from other young royals. Born with a visual impairment that required multiple surgeries, she grew up with a humility that fame and privilege often destroy. Her parents, Prince Edward and Sophie, made a deliberate choice to raise their children away from the spotlight, refusing royal titles that could have been theirs and insisting on normal education rather than royal privilege. This approach aligned perfectly with the values that Queen Elizabeth held privately, but couldn't always implement with other grandchildren. She watched Louise grow into a thoughtful, well-reared young woman who showed genuine interest in history, particularly royal history, without any apparent desire to exploit that connection for personal gain. Louise asked questions not to appear smart, but because she genuinely wanted to understand. She listened more than she spoke. And critically, she never, not once, leaked private family conversations to the press or used her royal connection for social media attention. The relationship deepened during summer visits to Balmoral. While other family members treated these as obligatory appearances, bringing friends and scheduling their stays around other commitments, Louise would come alone and stay longer. She accompanied the Queen on morning walks without expecting conversation, comfortable with silence in a way that's rare among young people. She spent afternoons in the library, genuinely absorbed in books rather than sneaking glances at her phone. Queen Elizabeth, who had spent a lifetime surrounded by people who wanted something from her, found Louise's lack of agenda refreshing. There were no requests for favors, subtle positioning for future advantage, or carefully crafted comments designed to curry favor. Louise simply enjoyed her grandmother's company, and the Queen responded by sharing more of herself than she typically revealed to anyone. During one particularly significant visit in the summer before the Queen's death, Louise helped her grandmother organize personal papers that had been accumulating for decades. While other family members would have seen this as tedious work to be delegated to staff, Louise recognized it for what it was, a window into history. She asked about photographs, wanted to know the context behind letters, and showed genuine fascination with the details of events that had shaped the modern world. It was during these long afternoons of sorting through memories that Queen Elizabeth made a decision. She needed someone to be the guardian of her private history, someone who would understand its significance without exploiting it for personal gain. Louise had proven herself not just worthy, but ideal for this responsibility. The Queen's ladies-in-waiting later recalled subtle changes in how she spoke about Louise. References to the one who listens and my archivist crept into conversations. When family members would occasionally dismiss Louise as shy or lacking ambition, the Queen would quietly correct them, pointing out that there's a difference between being quiet and being empty, between being private and being insignificant. But perhaps the most telling sign came from something the Queen did that summer. She gave Louise unrestricted access to her personal library at Balmoral, something even Charles had never been granted. Louise could browse, read, and even take books without asking permission first. For a monarch who had spent 70 years being carefully guarded in every aspect of her life, this level of trust was extraordinary. By the time Louise returned to her studies that fall, the decision had already been made. The Scottish estate with all its memories and historical treasures would go to the granddaughter who had proven she valued preservation over publicity and history over headlines. The Queen had found her successor, not to the throne, but to something she considered equally important, the guardianship of her authentic self. How did Camilla's family react to this news? When the Parker BS family learned the truth, the revelation that Lady Louise had inherited the Queen's private estate hit Camilla's family like a physical blow. For years, they had watched their position within the royal framework strengthen. Camilla had gone from mistress to wife to Queen consort. Her children, while not given titles, had gradually been folded into the family narrative, attending more events, receiving more recognition and building relationships they hoped would solidify their place in royal history. And then, with one hidden document, they discovered they'd been outmaneuvered by a 20-year-old who had never once appeared to be playing the game at all. The Queen's choice to bypass her son's wife's family entirely, to give her most personal possession to a granddaughter who shared no blood with Camilla's children, sent an unmistakable message about who truly belonged in the inner circle. The discovery that Queen Elizabeth had deliberately excluded them from her most private legacy was devastating. More than the material value, it was the rejection they couldn't ignore. The Queen had looked at the whole family, including Camilla's children, and decided they didn't merit access to her personal sanctuary. Instead, she'd chosen someone who, by traditional measures, should have been far down the line of consideration. Initial reactions within Camilla's immediate family were reportedly explosive. Phone calls between family members grew heated as they tried to understand what had happened. How had they missed this? When had the Queen made this decision? And more importantly, could it be contested? Camilla herself, according to palace insiders, oscillated between anger and hurt. She had spent years working to rehabilitate her image to move past the controversy of her relationship with Charles and become an accepted member of the family. She had played by the rules, followed protocol, and genuinely tried to build bridges with family members. And yet, Queen Elizabeth's final act had been to very clearly delineate who was really family and who was merely adjacent to it. The situation was complicated by the fact that Charles himself seemed blindsided. If the king hadn't known about the estate or his mother's plans for it, then Camilla could hardly be blamed for not anticipating the inheritance. But that rational assessment did nothing to ease the emotional impact. Whether Charles knew or not, the message was clear. Louise was in and the Parker BS children were out. Tom Parker BS was reportedly the first to suggest legal action. He consulted with attorneys who specialized in estate law, looking for any angle that might contest the inheritance. Could they argue that the Queen hadn't been fully competent when she made the designation? Could they claim the property should have been considered part of the Crown estate rather than private holdings? Was there any procedural irregularity that might invalidate the transfer? The legal expert's assessment was not encouraging. The document was dated years before the Queen's death, eliminating any argument about deathbed decisions made under duress or confusion. Multiple witnesses had verified the Queen's signature and mental clarity at the time. The property's status as private rather than Crown holding was well established through decades of separate ownership. There were no procedural errors, no ambiguous language, no legal loopholes to exploit. But more dangerous than the lack of legal options was the public relations catastrophe that challenging the Queen's wishes would create. Even floating the idea of contesting the inheritance had leaked to the press. And the reaction had been immediate and brutal. The British public, still mourning their longest-serving monarch, was outraged at the suggestion that the Queen's final wishes should be questioned. Editorial pages condemned the grasping behavior of Camilla's family. Social media erupted with hashtags defending Louise and attacking the Parker BS clan. The situation escalated when someone likely from within the legal team Camilla's family had consulted leaked the specific arguments they were considering. The suggestion that Queen Elizabeth might not have been fully competent crossed a line that the public would not tolerate. Polls showed overwhelming opposition to any legal challenge, with many respondents saying it would permanently damage their view of Camilla and Charles if they allowed such a contest to proceed. Senior advisors to King Charles reportedly held emergency meetings to discuss damage control. The consensus was clear. Any legal challenge must be stopped immediately. The cost to the monarchy's reputation would be catastrophic. Charles found himself in an impossible position, caught between his wife's hurt feelings and angry family on one side and his mother's legacy and public opinion on the other. How did the entire thing unravel? The confrontation that exposed everything. The meeting between Prince Edward and Camilla was never supposed to happen. Both sides had been advised to let the matter settle quietly to avoid direct confrontation that could escalate into permanent family rupture. But emotions were running too high and the stakes felt too important for strategic patience. Camilla requested the meeting, framing it as an attempt to understand the situation and find common ground. Edward, as Louis's father, felt obligated to defend his daughter against what he saw as unfair attacks. What was meant to be a private conversation in a small sitting room at Clarence House turned into something far more intense. According to staff members who were within earshot, Camilla began by expressing her confusion and hurt. She outlined the years of effort she'd put into becoming an accepted family member, the sacrifices she'd made to support Charles, and the careful way she tried to build relationships across generations. And then she pivoted to the accusation that had been simmering beneath the surface all along, that Edward and Sophie had deliberately cultivated Louise's relationship with the Queen for exactly this purpose, to secure an inheritance that would elevate their branch of the family. Edward's response was reportedly immediate and cold. He pointed out that Louise's relationship with her grandmother had developed naturally without any orchestration or ulterior motive. He noted that Louise had never asked for anything, never positioned herself for advantage, and had been just as surprised as everyone else by the inheritance. He went further, suggesting that if Camilla's family felt excluded, perhaps they should examine why the Queen hadn't felt close enough to them to share this part of her life. The conversation deteriorated from there. Camilla allegedly brought up the differences in royal hierarchy, pointing out that as Queen Consort, she outranked Edward and his entire family. She suggested that the inheritance undermined that structure and set a dangerous precedent. Edward countered that rank had nothing to do with personal relationships and that the Queen's choice of who to trust with her private legacy was hers alone to make. The breakthrough or breaking point, depending on perspective, came when Camilla questioned whether the Queen had been fully aware of what she was doing. The suggestion that Elizabeth might have been manipulated or confused brought Edward to his feet. He reportedly told Camilla in no uncertain terms that questioning the Queen's mental capacity was not just offensive, but potentially catastrophic for the entire family, and that if she continued down that path, she would face opposition not just from him, but from other family members who would not tolerate such disrespect to the late monarch's memory. Sophie, Edward's wife, had been present but quiet through most of the exchange. She chose this moment to speak, and her comments reportedly shifted the dynamic entirely. She calmly pointed out that the real issue wasn't the inheritance itself, but what it revealed about relationships within the family. The Queen had chosen to share her most private sanctuary with someone she trusted completely. Rather than attacking Louise or questioning the Queen's decision, perhaps everyone should reflect on why those trust relationships had developed the way they did. The meeting ended without resolution. Camilla left first, visibly upset. Edward and Sophie remained, reportedly discussing damage control strategies to protect Louise from the escalating family conflict. Word of the confrontation spread quickly through palace circles, with different versions emerging depending on which side's supporters were telling the story. What no one disputed was that the confrontation had made reconciliation much harder. Lines had been drawn, accusations made, and trust damaged. The inheritance had exposed fault lines in the family that went far deeper than anyone had realized. The summer that decided everything. To truly understand why Queen Elizabeth made the choice she did, you have to go back to that last full summer she spent in Scotland. It was the summer of 2019, 3 years before her death, and the summer that the secret document was created. Something happened during those months that crystallized the Queen's thinking and led to a decision that would eventually tear her family apart. Louise had arrived at Balmoral in early July, planning to stay a few weeks before returning to her studies. But the Queen asked her to extend the visit, then extended it again. By the time Louise finally left in late September, she'd spent the better part of 3 months as her grandmother's companion in a way that seemed to fulfill something the Queen had been missing. During long walks across the estate, Louise asked the question that changed everything. She wanted to know what would happen to the Queen's private papers, the ones that told the real story of her reign rather than the sanitized version that would end up in official archives. Who would decide what scholars could see? Who would protect the privacy of people who had confided in her? Who would make sure that history got the nuanced truth rather than simplified narratives? The Queen didn't have a good answer. She'd always assumed this would be handled by official channels, by archivists and royal historians working under strict protocols. But Louise's questions made her realize that official channels meant public channels. That nothing she left in official hands would remain truly private. Everything would eventually be released, analyzed, and picked apart by people with no connection to the moments that created those papers. That realization was troubling. The Queen had spent 70 years being careful about what she said publicly, knowing that every word would be preserved and scrutinized. Her private papers were different. They contained her actual thoughts, her real opinions, and her unfiltered reactions to events as they unfolded. She'd created them with the assumption they'd remain private, or at least be protected by people who understood context and nuance. Louise, without pushing or asking for anything, had made the Queen see that she needed a different solution. She needed someone who understood the historical value of preserving these materials, but who also understood the human need to protect privacy and dignity. Someone who would resist pressure to monetize or sensationalize, who would say no to profitable book deals or documentary projects that would exploit private pain for public consumption. Over the course of that summer, the Queen tested Louise in small ways. She'd share stories about past controversies, watching to see if Louise would repeat them to family members or let details slip in casual conversation. She didn't. She'd ask Louise's opinion on how certain papers should be handled, looking for signs of ambition or self-interest. She found none. Most tellingly, she'd occasionally leave valuable items in Louise's care, and they always remained exactly where they'd been left, never moved or examined beyond what was necessary. By September, the Queen had made her decision. She met with her private solicitors and began the process of creating a trust that would transfer ownership of the Scottish estate along with everything it contained to Lady Louise Windsor upon the Queen's death. She structured it to bypass official royal channels, to remain hidden until after she was gone, and to be legally unassailable once revealed. The Queen knew this decision would cause conflict. She wasn't naive about family dynamics or the hurt feelings that would result from such a clear statement of preference. But she'd also reached a point in her life where protecting her legacy mattered more than avoiding family drama. She'd spent 70 years putting duty before personal preference. This would be one of the few times she did the opposite. The document she created included a personal letter to Louise, not the recorded message that would be discovered years later, but a written explanation of her reasoning. In it, she acknowledged that Louise might face criticism and conflict because of this inheritance. She apologized in advance for the burden she was placing on her granddaughter. But she also expressed absolute confidence that Louise was the right choice, the only choice. Because she represented qualities the Queen valued above all others: discretion, integrity, and a genuine respect for history over headlines. When Louise left Balmoral that September, she knew about the estate and the Queen's plans, but she'd been sworn to secrecy, told that the transfer wouldn't happen for years, and urged to continue living her life exactly as she had been. The Queen didn't want Louise to feel burdened by expectation or to change her behavior based on future inheritance. She just wanted Louise to know that she was trusted, valued, and seen as the keeper of memories that mattered more than crowns. And as Lady Louise steps into guardianship of the Queen's most private legacy, will discretion be enough to withstand the pressures now closing in around her? Share your thoughts with us in the comments section. Remember to like, share, and subscribe for more. Also click the next video showing on your screen.